Book the Eighth, Chapter 2 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Céline Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 2. Phoenicians are rising. While Mr. Hawkehurst arranged his affairs with the clerk of St. Matthias in the Fields, in the parish of Marylebone, George Sheldon sat in his brother's office writing a letter to that distinguished stockbroker. The pretext of writing a letter was the simplest pretext for being alone in his brother's room, and to be alone in Philip Sheldon's room was the first step in the business which George had to do. The room was distractingly neat, and as handsomely furnished as it is possible for an office to be within the closest official limits. A Spanish mahogany desk with a cylinder cover, and innumerable drawers fitted with invisible Bramah locks, occupied the centre of the room, and 4 ponderous Spanish mahogany chairs, with padded backs, and seats covered with crimson morocco, were primly arranged against the wall. Upon the mantelpiece ticked a skeleton clock, above which there hung the sternest and grimmest of almanacs, on either whereof were fastened divers lists and calendars of awful character, affected by gentlemen on 'Change. Before penetrating to this innermost and sacred chamber, George Sheldon wasted some little time in agreeable gossip with a gentleman whom he found yawning over the Times newspaper in an outer and less richly furnished apartment. This gentleman was Philip Sheldon's clerk, the younger son of a rich Yorkshire farmer, who had come to London with the intention of making his fortune on the Stock Exchange, and whose father had paid a considerable sum in order to obtain for this young man the privilege of reading the Times in Mr. Sheldon's office, and picking up whatever knowledge might be obtained from the business transactions of his employer. The career of Philip Sheldon had been watched with some interest by his fellow townsmen of Barlingford. They had seen him leave that town with a few hundreds in his pocket, and they had heard of him 12 years afterwards as a prosperous stockbroker, with a handsome house and a handsome carriage, and the reputation of being one of the sharpest men in the city. The accounts of him that came to Barlingford were all more or less exaggerated, and the men who discussed his cleverness and his good luck were apt to forget that he owed the beginning of his fortunes to Tom Halliday's £18,000. The one fact that impressed Philip Sheldon's townsmen was the fact that a Barlingford man had made money on the Stock Exchange, and the one inference they drew therefrom was the inference that other Barlingford men might do the same. Thus it happened that Mr. Stephen Orcott, of Plymley Rise Farm, near Barlingford, being at a loss what to do with a somewhat refractory younger son, resolved upon planting his footsteps in the path so victoriously trodden by Philip Sheldon. He wrote to Philip, asking him to receive the young man as clerk, assistant, secretary, anything, with a view to an ultimate junior partnership. And Philip consented, upon certain conditions. The sum he demanded was rather a stiff one, as it seemed to Stephen Orcott, but he opined that such a sum would not have been asked if the advantages had not been proportionately large. The bargain was therefore concluded, and Mr. Frederick Orcott came to London. He was a young man of horsey propensities, gifted with a sublime contempt for any kind of business requiring application or industry, and with a supreme belief in his own merits. George Sheldon had known Frederick Orcott as a boy, and had been in his society some half-dozen times since his coming to London. He apprehended no difficulty in obtaining from this young gentleman any information he had the power to afford. "How do, Orcott?" he said with agreeable familiarity. "My brother Phil not come back yet?" "No," replied the other sulkily. "There have been ever so many people here bothering me about him. Where has he gone? And when will he be back? And so on. I might as well be some footman if I'm to sit here answering questions all day. High Wycombe races are on to-day, and I wanted to see Barmaid run before I put my money on her for Goodwood. She was bred down our way, you see, and I know she's like enough to win the cup, if she's fit. They don't know much about her this way either, though she's own sisters to Boots, that won the Chester Cup last year, owing to Topham's being swindled into letting him off with £7. He ran at the York Spring, you see, for a 2-penny halfpenny plate, and the boy that rode him pulled his head half off. I saw him do it, and then he won the Chester, and brought his owners a pot of money, This information was not exactly what George Sheldon wanted, but he planted himself on the hearth rug in an easy attitude, with his back against the mantelpiece, and appeared much interested in Mr. Orcott's discourse. "Anything stirring in the city?" he asked presently. "Stirring? No, nothing stirring but stagnation, as some fellow said in a play I saw the other night. Barlingford folks say your brother Philip has made a heap of money on the Stock Exchange; but if he has, he must have done a good deal more business before I came to him than he has done lately. I can't see how a man is to develop into a Rothschild out of an occasional 2 and 6 per cent on the transfer of some old woman's savings from railway stock to consols, and that's about the only kind of business I've seen much of lately. Of course Phil Sheldon has got irons of his own in the fire, for he's an uncommonly deep card, you see, that brother of yours, and it isn't to be expected he'll tell me all he's up to. I know he's up to his eyebrows in companies, but I don't see how he's to make his fortune out of them, for limited liability nowadays seems only another name for unlimited cash. However, I don't care. It pleased my governor to get me into Sheldon's office, and it suited my book to come to London. But if the author of my being thinks I'm going to addle my blessed brains with the decline and fall of the money market, he's a greater fool than I took him for, and that's saying a great deal." And here Mr. Frederick Orcott lapsed into admiring contemplation of his boots, which were the chef d'oeuvre of a sporting bootmaker, boots that were of the ringy, and of the cornery. "Ah," said George, "and Phil doesn't tell you much of his affairs, doesn't he? That's a rather bad sign, I should think. Looks as if he was rather down upon his luck, eh?" "Well, there's no knowing, you see, with that sort of close fish. He may have made his book for a great haul, and may be keeping himself quiet till the event comes off. He may be laying on to something with all his might, you know, on safe information. But there's one thing I know he stands to lose by." "What's that?" "The Phoenician loan. He speculated in the bonds when they began to go down, and I'm blessed if they haven't been dropping ever since, 1/8 a day, as regular as the day comes round. He bought them for the March account, and has been paying contango since then and holding on in hopes of a rise. I don't know whether the purchase was a large one, but I know he's been uncommonly savage about the drop. He bought on the strength of private information from the other side of the Channel. The Emperor was putting his own money into the Phoenician business, and it was the best game out, and so on. But he seems to have been made a fool of, for once in a way." "The bonds may steady themselves." "Yes, they may. But, on the other hand, they mayn't. There are the Stock Exchange lists, with Phoenicians ticked off by your brother's own pen. A steady drop, you see." "Let me have a telegram if there's a sudden rise," said Sheldon to me the day he left London. "They'll go up with rush when they do move." "But they've been moving the other way ever since, and I think if he stayed away till doomsday it would be pretty much the same. Phoenicians are rising rapidly. Come back to town." These were the words of the telegraphic despatch which shaped itself in George Sheldon's brain, as his brother's clerk revealed the secrets of his employer. It was found, the solution of the one great question as to how Philip Sheldon was to be lured away from the bedside of his unconscious victim. Here was the bait. "I knew I could do it. I knew I could get all I wanted to know out of the shallow-brained idiot," he said to himself triumphantly. And then he told the shallow-brained idiot that he thought he would write a line to his brother, and on that pretence went into Philip's office. Here, use his eyes as he might, he could discover nothing, he could glean no stray scrap of information. The secrets that could be guarded by concealed Bramah locks and iron safes, with mystic words to be learned by the man who would open them, Philip Sheldon knew how to protect. Unhappily for himself, he had been compelled to confide some of his secrets to human receptacles not to be guarded by Bramah locks or mystic words. The lawyer did not waste much time in his brother's office. A very hasty investigation showed him there was nothing to be learned from those bare walls and that inviolable cylinder-topped desk. He scribbled a few lines of commonplace at a table by the window, sealed and addressed his note, and then departed to dispatch his telegram. "Phoenicians are rising rapidly," he wrote, and that was all. He signed the despatch Frederick Orcott. "Phil and Orcott may settle the business between them," he said to himself, as he forged the Yorkshireman's name. What I have to do is to get Phil away, and give Hawkehurst a chance of saving Tom Halliday's daughter, and I shan't stand upon trifles in the doing of it." After having despatched this telegram, George Sheldon found himself much too restless and excited for ordinary business. He, so renowned even amongst cool hands for exceptional coolness, was on this occasion thoroughly unnerved. He dropped into a city tavern, and refreshed himself with a dram. But, amidst all the bustle and clatter of a crowded bar, the face of Tom Halliday, haggard and worn with illness, was before his eyes, and the sound of Tom Halliday's voice was in his ears. "I can't settle to anything this afternoon," he said to himself. "I'll run down to Bayswater and see whether Hawkehurst has managed matters with Nancy Woolper." Chapter 2. Read by Céline Major. Book the 8th, Chapter 3 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Céline Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 3. The Sorte Virgilianée. While George Sheldon was still in the depths of the city, Valentine Hawkehurst arrived at the Gothic villa, where he asked to see Mrs. Woolper. Of the woman herself he knew very little. He had seen her once or twice when some special mission brought her to the drawing-room, and from Charlotte he had heard much of her affectionate solicitude. To have been kind to his Charlotte was the strongest claim to his regard. This woman's help would be of inestimable service, he thought. Her age, her experience of sickness, her familiarity with the patient, especially adapt her for the office she will be required to fill. If Dr. Jedd should order a nurse to watch by the sick bed, here is the nurse. If it should prove possible to remove the dear sufferer, here is the guardian best calculated to protect and attend her removal. That the desperate step of an immediate marriage would be a wise step Valentine could not doubt, since it would at once annihilate Mr. Sheldon's chances and destroy his motive. But in contemplating this desperate step, Valentine had to consider the reputation as well as the safety of his future wife. He was determined that there should be no opportunity for scandal in the circumstances of his stolen marriage, no scope for future mischief from the malignity of that baffled villain to whose schemes their marriage would give the death-blow. He, who from his cradle had been familiar with the darker side of life, knew how often the innocent carry a lifelong burden, and perform a perpetual penance for the sins or the follies of others. And over his darling's life in the future, should it please God that he might save her, he would have no shadow cast by imprudence of his in the present. This sharp-witted, sharp-tongued Yorkshire woman will be the woman of women to protect her, he thought, as he seated himself in Mr. Sheldon's study, whither the prim parlour-maid had ushered him. "Mrs. Woolper have just gone upstairs to clean herself," she said, "which we are a-having the dining-room and drawing-room carpets up, while the family are away. Would you please to wait?" Valentine looked at his watch. "I cannot wait very long," he said, "and I shall be obliged if you will tell Mrs. Woolper that I wish to see her on very important business." The parlour-maid departed, and Valentine was left to endure the weariness of waiting until Mrs. Woolper should have "cleaned herself." Mr. Sheldon's study at Bayswater did not offer much more to the eye of the investigator than Mr. Sheldon's office in the city. There were the handsomely bound books behind the inviolable plate-glass doors, and there was the neat writing-table with the machine for weighing letters, and the large business-like-looking blotting-pad, and the ponderous brass-rimmed inkstand, with no nonsense about it, and yonder, on a clumsy little oak-table with thick legs, appeared the copying-machine, with a big black iron lever, and a massive screw with which to screw all the spontaneous feeling out of every letter that came beneath its crushing influence. Up and down this joyless den Valentine Hawkehurst paced, with the demon of impatience raging in his breast. The July sunshine blazed hot upon the window, and the voices of croquet-players in the adjacent gardens rose shrill upon the summer air. And there were girls playing croquet while she, his rose of the garden of girls, lay sick unto death. Oh, why could he not offer a hecatomb of these common creatures as a substitute for that one fair spirit? He looked into the garden, the prim modern garden, but a few years reclaimed from that abomination of desolation, the eligible lot of building land. Across the well-kept lawn there brooded no shadow of old-world cedar, no century-old espaliers divided flower and kitchen ground. No box edging of the early Hanoverian era bordered the beds of roses and mignonette. From one boundary wall to the other there was not a bush old enough to hang an association upon. The stereotyped bed of flaming yellow calceolaria balanced the conventional bed of flaming crimson verbena. The lavender heliotrope faced the scarlet geranium like the four corners in a quadrille. The garden was the modern nurseryman's ideal of suburban horticulture, and no more. But to Valentine this half-acre of smooth lawn and Wimbledon gravel pathway had seemed fair as those pleasure gardens of Semiramis at the foot of Bagistanos mountain, the fame whereof tempted Alexander to turn aside from the direct road during his march from Cologne to the Nicaeic horse pastures. To-day the contemplation of that commonplace garden gave him direful pain. Should he ever walk there again with his dear love, or in any other garden upon earth? And then he thought of fairer gardens, in supernal regions whither his soul was slow to travel. "Not easy is the journey from earth to the stars," says the sage, and from this young wanderer the stain of earthly travel had yet to be washed away. "If she is taken from me, shall I ever be pure enough to follow her?" he asked himself. "Will a life that began in such darkness ever rise to the light which is her natural element? If she is taken, and I stay behind, and bear my burden patiently in the hope to follow her, will there not be a gate closed against me in the skies, beyond which I shall see her, shining among her kindred spirits, in the white robes of perfect innocence? Ah, my love, my love! As between us on this earth must for ever be a gulf your pure soul cannot pass, so between us in the skies will rise a barrier to sever me from your sweet company." The thought of probable separation upon earth, of possible separation in heaven, was too bitter for him. "I will not think of these things," he said to himself. "I will not believe in that possibility of this sacrifice. Ah, no! She will be saved. Against the bright young life the awful fiat has not gone forth. Providence has been with me to day. Providence will go with me till the end." He thought how other men had so stood, as he was standing now, face to face with the great uncertainty, the crisis, the turning point, the pivot on which life itself revolved. The pendulum of the mighty clock swings solemnly to and fro, with every vibration a moment, with every moment each man's shrouded fates move another step in their inexorable progress, and the end? What was the goal towards which those dark, relentless shapes were moving? He thought of Rousseau, balancing the awful question of his soul's salvation, his poor weak soul adrift upon a sea of doubt. "Behold yonder tree which faces me, as I sit and meditate the problem of my destiny, the destiny of me, Jean Jacques Rousseau, self-conscious genius, and future regenerator of my age. I pick up a pebble, and poise it between my fingers before taking my aim. In another moment the question will be answered. If the pebble hits the tree, I, Jean Jacques, am reserved for salvation. If I miss, oh, awful, overwhelming possibility! My name will blaze upon that dreadful scroll which numbers the damned. Happily, the tree is bulky, and within but a few yards of the speculator, and the great enigma of the Calvinistic Church is answered in favour of Madame de Warenne's protégé, whose propensities and proclivities at that period did not very strongly indicate his claim to a place among the elect. Valentine remembered the Sortes Virgilianae, the Wesleyan's drawing of inferences from Bible texts. Ah, could he not find an answer to the question that was the one thought of his mind? He would find some answer, a lying oracle, perhaps. It might be a voice from heaven, some temporary assuagement of the storm of doubt that raged his breast. "I doubt if Mr. Sheldon owns either a Bible or an Aeneid," he said to himself, as he stopped in his rapid pacing of the room. "I will open the first book I can put my hand upon, and from the first line my eye falls on will draw an augury." He looked about the room. Behind the glazed doors of the mahogany bookcase appeared Hume and Smollett, Scott and Shakespeare; and conspicuous among these a handsome family Bible. But the glazed doors were locked. In Mr. Sheldon's study there appeared to be no other books than these few standard works. Yes, on some obscure little shelves, low down in one of the recesses formed by the projection of the fireplace and the chimney, there were 3 rows of large quarto volumes, in dingy dark green cloth cases. What these volumes might contain Valentine Hawkehurst knew not, and the very fact of his ignorance rendered these books all the more suitable for the purpose of augury. To dip for a sentence into any of these unknown volumes would be a leap in darkness more profound than he could find in the Bible or the Aeneid, where his own foreknowledge of the text might unwittingly influence the oracle. He went over to the recess, bent down, and ran his hand along the backs of the volumes, with his face turned away from the books towards the window. "The first obstruction that arrests my hand shall determine my choice of the volume," he said to himself. His hand ran easily along the volumes on the upper shelf, easily along the volumes on the second shelf, and he began to doubt whether this mode of determining his choice could be persisted in. But in its progress along the third and lowest range of volumes, his hand was arrested midway by a book which projected about half an inch beyond its fellows. He took this book out and carried it to the table, still without looking at it. He opened it, or rather let its leaves fall open of their own accord, still without looking at it, and then, with a strange superstitious fear, mingled in his mind with the natural shame that accompanied his conscious folly, he looked at the page before him. The line on which he fixed his eye was the heading of a letter. It was in larger type than the rest of the page, and it was very plain to him as he stood a little way from the table, looking down at the open book. The line ran thus: "On the fallibility of copper gauze as a test for the detection of arsenic." The book was a volume of the Lancet. The date, 20 years ago. "What an oracle!" thought Valentine, with a cynical laugh at his own folly, and some slight sense of relief. In all feeble tamperings with powers invisible there lurks a sense of terror in the weak human heart. He had tempted those invisible ones, and the oracle he only half believed in might have spoken to his confusion and dismay. He was glad to think the oracle meant nothing. And yet, even in this dry as dust title of a scientific communication from a distinguished toxicologist, there was some sinister significance. It was the letter of a great chemist, who demonstrated therein the fallibility of all tests in relation to a certain poison. It was one of those papers which, while they aid the cause of science, may also further the dark processes of the poisoner, by showing him the forces he has to encounter, and the weapons with which he may defend himself from their power. It is needless to dwell here upon the contents of this letter, one of a series on the same subject or range of subjects. Valentine read it with eager interest. For him it had a terrible importance in its relation to the past and to the present. "I let the book fall open, and it opened at that letter," he thought to himself. "Will it open there a second time, I wonder?" He repeated the experiment, and the book opened in the same place. Again and again the book opened as before. Again, many times, and the result was still the same. After this he examined the book, and found that it had been pressed open at this page, as by a reader leaning on the opened volume. He examined it still more closely, and found here and there on a page faint indications of a pencil, which had underscored certain lines, and the marks of which had been as far as possible erased. The deduction to be drawn from these small facts seemed only too clear to Valentine Hawkehurst. By some one reader the pages had been deliberately and carefully studied. Could he doubt that reader to have been the man in whose possession he found the book, the man whom that very day he had heard plainly denounced as a poisoner? He drew out the previous volume, and in this a rapid search revealed to him a second fact, significant as the last. An old envelope marked the place where appeared an article on the coincidences common to the diagnostics of a certain type of low fever and the diagnostics of a certain class of poisons. Here the volume again opened of itself, and a blot of ink on the page seemed to indicate that the open book had been leant upon by a person engaged in making memoranda of its contents. Nor was this all. The forgotten envelope that marked the place had its own dismal significance. The postmark bore the date of the year and the month in which Charlotte's father had died. While this volume was still open in his hand, the door opened suddenly, and Mrs. Woolper came into the room. She had kept Valentine waiting more than half an hour. He had little more than half an hour at most in which to break the ice of absolute strangeness, and sound the very depths of this woman's character. If she had come to him earlier, when his plan of action was clear and definite, his imagination in abeyance, he would have gone cautiously to work, with slowness and deliberation. Coming to him now, when his mind, unsettled by the discovery of fresh evidence against Philip Sheldon, was divided between the past and the present, she took him off his guard, and he plunged at once into the subject that absorbed all his thoughts. Mrs. Woolper looked from Valentine to the open books on the table with a vague terror in her face. "I am sorry I was so long, sir, but I've been polishing the grates and fenders, and such like, and my hands and face were blacker than a sweep's. I hope there's nothing wrong at the seaside, where Miss—" "There is much that's wrong, Mrs. Woolper. Hopelessly, irrevocably wrong. Miss Halliday is ill, very ill, doomed to die, if she remain in your master's keeping." "Lord help us, Mr. Hawkehurst, what do you mean?" The terror in her face was no longer a vague terror. It had taken a form and substance, and was a terror unutterably hideous, if ever human countenance gave expression to human thought. "I mean that your master is better skilled in the use of the agents that kill than the agents that cure. Charlotte's father came to Philip Sheldon's house a hale, strong man, in the very prime of manhood. In that house he sickened of a nameless disease, and died, carefully tended by his watchful friend. The same careful watcher stands by Charlotte Halliday's deathbed, and she is dying." "Dying! Oh, sir, for God's sake, don't say that!" "She is dying, as her father died before her, by the hand of Philip Sheldon." "Oh, sir, Mr. Hawkehurst!" cried the old woman, with clasped hands lifted in piteous supplication towards her master's denouncer. "It's not true! It is not true! For God's dear love, don't tell me it is true! I nursed him when he was a baby, sir, and there wasn't a little trouble I had to bear with him that didn't make him all the dearer to me. I have sat up all the night through, sir, times and often, when he was ill, and have heard Barlingford church clock strike every hour of the long night. And oh, if I had known that this could ever come to him, I should have wished him dead in the little crib where he lay and seemed so innocent. I tell you, sir, it can't be true. His father and mother had been respected and looked up to in Barlingford for many a year, his grandfather and grandmother before them. There isn't a name that stands better in those parts than the name of Sheldon. Do you think such a man would poison his friend?" "I said nothing about poison, Mrs. Woolper," said Valentine sternly. This woman had known all, and had held her tongue like the rest, it seemed. To Valentine there was unutterable horror in the thought that a cold-blooded murder could be thus perpetrated in the sight of several people, and yet no voice be raised to denounce the assassin. "And this is our modern civilization," he said to himself. "Give me the desert or the jungle. The sons of Bowanee are no worse than Mr. Sheldon, and one might be on one's guard against them." Nancy Woolper looked at him aghast. He had said nothing about poison. What, then, had she betrayed her master? He saw that she had known, or strongly suspected, the worst in the case of Tom Halliday, and that she would easily be influenced to do all he wanted of her. "Mrs. Woolper, you must help me to save Charlotte," he said with intensity. "You made no attempt to save her father, though you suspected the cause of his death. I have this day seen Mr. Burkham, the doctor, who attended Mr. Halliday, and from his lips I have heard the truth. I want you to accompany me to Hastings, and to take your place by Charlotte's bed, as her nurse and guardian. If Mr. Sheldon suspects your knowledge of the past, and I have little doubt that he does, a look in the housekeeper's face told him that he was right, you are of all people best fitted to guard that dear girl. Your part will not be a difficult one. If we dare remove her, we will remove her beyond the reach of that man's power. If not, Your task will be to prevent food or medicine that his hand has touched from approaching her lips. You can do it. It will only be a question of tact and firmness. We shall have one of the greatest doctors in London for our guide. Will you come?" "I don't believe my master poisoned his friend," said Nancy Woolper doggedly, "nor I won't believe it. You can't force me to think bad of him. I loved when he was little and helpless, and I carried him in my arms. What are you and your fine London doctor, Mr. Burkham? He was but a poor fondy, as I mind well, that I should take your word against my master." "If that young man thought as Mr. Halliday was being poisoned, why didn't he speak out, like a man, then? It's a fine piece of work to bring it up against my master 11 years afterwards. As for young Missy, she's as sweet a young creature as ever lived, and I'd do anything to serve her. But I won't think, and I can't think, that my master would hurt a hair of her head. What would he gain by it?" "He has settled that with himself. He has gained by the death of Tom Halliday, and depend upon it he has made his plans to gain by the death of Tom Halliday's daughter." "I won't believe it," the old woman repeated in the same dogged tone. For such resistance as this Mr. Hawkehurst was in no manner prepared. He looked at his watch. The half hour was nearly gone. There was little more time for argument. "Great Heaven!" he said to himself. "What argument can I employ to influence this woman's obdurate heart?" What argument, indeed? He knew of none stronger than those he had used. He stood for some moments baffled and helpless, staring absently at the face of his watch, and wondering what he was to do next. As Valentine Hawkehurst stood thus, there came a loud ringing of the bell, following quickly on the sound of wheels grinding against the curbstone. Mrs. Woolper opened the door and looked out into the hall. "It's master!" cried one of the maids, emerging from the disorganized dining-room, "and Mrs., and Miss Halliday, and Mass Paget, and all the house topsy-turvy." "Charlotte here!" exclaimed Valentine. "You are dreaming, girl." "And you told me she was dying," said Mrs. Woolper with a look of triumph. "What becomes of your fine story now?" "It is Miss Halliday!" cried the housemaid, as she opened the door. "And, oh my!" she added, looking back into the hall with a sorrowful face, "how bad she do look!" Valentine ran out to the gate. Yes, there were two cabs, one laden with luggage, the two cabmen busy about the doors of the vehicles, a little group of stragglers waiting to see the invalid young lady alight. It was the next best thing to a funeral. "Oh, don't she look white!" cried a shrill girl with a baby in her arms. "In a decline, I dessay, poor young thing," said a matron, in an audible aside to her companion. Valentine dashed amongst the group of stragglers. He pushed away the girl with the baby, the housemaid who had run out behind him, Mr. Sheldon, the cabman, every one, and in the next moment Charlotte was in his arms, and he was carrying her into the house. He felt as if he had been in a dream, and all that exceptional force which the dreamer sometimes feels he felt in this crisis. He carried his dear burden into the study, followed by Mr. Sheldon and Diana Paget. The face that dropped upon his shoulder showed deadly white against his dark blue coat. The hand which he clasped in his, how listless and feeble! "Valentine," the girl said in a low, drowsy voice, lifting her eyes to his face, "is this you? I have been so ill, so tired, and they would bring me away to be near the doctors, papa says. Do you think any doctors will be able to cure me?" "Yes, dear, with God's help. I am glad he has brought you here. And now I must run away," he said, when he had placed Charlotte in Mr. Sheldon's armchair. "For a very little while, darling. I have seen a doctor, a man in whom I have more confidence than I have in Dr. Doddleson. I am going to fetch him, my dearest," he added tenderly, as he felt the feeble hand cling to his. "I shall not be long. Do you think I shall not hurry back to you? My dearest one, when I return, it will be to stay with you for ever." She was too ill to note the significance of his words. She only knew that they gave her comfort. He hurried from the room. In less than an hour he must be at the London Bridge terminus, or in all probability the 5 o'clock train would carry Dr. Jedd to St. Leonard's, and on Dr. Jedd his chief hope rested. "Do you believe me now?" he asked of Mrs. Woolper as he went out into the hall. "I do," she answered in a whisper, "and I will do what you want." She took his hand in her wrinkled horny palm and grasped it firmly. He felt that in this firm pressure there was a promise as sacred as any oath ever registered on earth. He met Mr. Sheldon on the threshold, and passed him without a word. The time might come in which he would have to mask his thoughts, and stoop to the hateful hypocrisy of civility to this man; but he had not yet schooled himself to do this. At the gate he met George Sheldon. "What's up now?" asked the lawyer. "Did you send your message?" "Yes, I telegraphed to Phil." "It has been trouble wasted. He has brought her home." "What does that mean?" "Who knows? I pray God that he may have overreached himself. I have set a watch upon my dear love, and no further harm shall come to her. I'm going to fetch Dr. Jedd." "And you are not afraid of Phil's smelling a rat?" "I am afraid of nothing that he can do henceforward. If it is not too late to save her, I will save her." He waited for no more, but jumped into the cab. "London Bridge Terminus. You must get me there by 5:15," he said to the driver. George Sheldon went no further than the gate of his brother's domain. "I wonder whether the Harold's Hill people will send that telegram after him," he thought. "It'll be rather unpleasant for Fred Orcott if they do. But it's 10 to 1 they won't. The normal condition of every seaside lodging housekeeper is 1 degree removed from idiocy." End of Chapter 3. Read by Céline Major.
Book the Ninth, Chapter 1 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book the Ninth, Through the Furnace, Chapter 1, Something Too Much. "Is that young man mad?" asked Philip Sheldon as he went into his study immediately after Valentine had passed him in the hall. The question was not addressed to any particular individual, and Diana, who was standing near the door by which Mr. Sheldon entered, took upon herself to answer it. "I think he is very anxious," she said in a half whisper. "What brought him here just now? He did not know we were coming home." Mrs. Woolper answered this question. "He came for something for Miss Charlotte, sir, some books as she'd had from the library. They'd not been sent back, and he came to see about their being sent." "What books?" murmured Charlotte, but a pressure from Mrs. Woolper's hand prevented her saying more. "I never encountered any one with so little self-command," said Mr. Sheldon. "If he is going to rush in and out of my house in that manner, I must really put a stop to his visits altogether. I cannot suffer that kind of thing. For Charlotte's welfare, quiet is indispensable, and if Mr. Hawkehurst's presence is to bring noise and excitement, Mr. Hawkehurst must not cross this threshold." He spoke with suppressed anger, with such evident effort to restrain his anger that it would have seemed as if his indignation against Valentine was no common wrath. Charlotte caught his last words. "Dear papa," she pleaded in her faint voice, "pray do not be angry with Valentine. He is so anxious about me." "I am not angry with him, but while you are ill I will have quiet at any price." "Then I'm sure you should not have brought Charlotte home," exclaimed Georgie in tones of wailing and lamentation; "for of all the miseries in life there is nothing worse than coming home in the very midst of a general cleaning. It was agreed between Ann Woolper and me that there should be a general cleaning while we were away at the seaside. We were to be away a fortnight, and everything was to be as neat as a new pin when we came home. But here we are, back in less than a week, and everything at sixes and sevens. Where we are to dine I know not, and as for the carpets, they are all away at the beating place, and Ann tells me they won't be home till Friday." "We can exist without carpets," answered Mr. Sheldon in a hard, dry voice. "I suppose they are seeing to Miss Halliday's room?" he added, addressing himself to Mrs. Woolper. "Why don't you go and look after them, Nancy?" Sarah knows what she has to do. The bedrooms was done first, and there's not much amiss in Miss Charlotte's room." Mr. Sheldon dropped wearily into a chair. He looked pale and haggard. Throughout the journey he had been unfailing in his attention to the invalid, but the journey had been fatiguing, for Charlotte Halliday was very ill, so ill as to be unable to avoid inflicting trouble upon others. The weariness, the dizziness, the dull intervals of semi-consciousness, the helpless tottering walk, which was like the walk of intoxication rather than ordinary weakness, the clouded sight, all the worst symptoms of this nameless disease had every hour grown more alarming. Against this journey to London Mrs. Sheldon and Diana had pleaded, Georgie with as much earnestness as she could command, Diana as forcibly as she dared argue a question in which her voice had so little weight. But upon this point Mr. Sheldon was adamant. "She will be better off in London," he said resolutely. "This trip to the seaside was a whim of my wife's, and, like most other whims of my wife's, it has entailed trouble and expense upon me. Of course I know that Georgie did it for the best," he added, in reply to a reproachful "Oh, Philip!" from Mrs. Sheldon, "but the whole business has been a mistake. No sooner are we comfortably settled down here than Hawkehurst takes it into his head to be outrageously alarmed about Charlotte, and wants to bring half a dozen doctors round the poor girl's bed, to her inevitable peril, for in an illness which begins and ends in mental depression all appearance of alarm is calculated to do mischief." Having said this, Mr. Sheldon lost no time in making arrangements for the journey. A carriage was ordered. All possible preparations were made for the comfort of the invalid. Everything that care or kindness could do was done. But the cruelty of the removal was not the less obvious. Georgie wailed piteously about the sixes and sevens to which they were being taken. Diana cared nothing about sixes and sevens, but she felt supreme indignation against Charlotte's stepfather, and she did not attempt to conceal her feelings. Nor was it without an effort to oppose Mr. Sheldon's authority that Miss Paget succumbed to the force of circumstances. She appealed to his wife. "Dear Mrs. Sheldon, I beg you not to suffer Lotta's removal," she said earnestly. "You do not know how ill she is, nor can Mr. Sheldon know, or he would not take such a step. As her mother, your authority is superior to his. You have but to say that she shall not be taken from this house in her present state of prostration and sickness." "I have only to say?" cried Georgie piteously. "Oh, Diana, how can you say such a thing? What would be Mr. Sheldon's feelings if I were to stand up against him, and declare that Charlotte should not be moved? And he so anxious too, and so clever. I'm sure his conduct about my poor dear Lotta is positively beautiful. I never saw such anxiety. Why, he has grown 10 years older in his looks since the beginning of her illness. People go on about stepfather this and stepfather that, until a poor young widow is almost frightened to marry again. But I don't believe a real father ever was more thoughtful or more careful about a real daughter than Philip has been about Lotta. And what a poor return it would be if I were to oppose him now, when he says that the removal will be for Charlotte's good, and that she will be near clever doctors, if she should require clever doctors. You don't know how experienced he is, and how thoughtful. I shall never forget his kindness to poor Tom." "Yes," exclaimed Miss Paget impatiently, "but Mr. Halliday died." "Oh, Diana," whimpered Georgie, "I did not think you could be so unkind as to remind me of that." "I only want to remind you that Mr. Sheldon is not infallible." Mr. Sheldon entered the room at this juncture, and Diana left it, passionately indignant against the poor weak creature, to whom no crisis, no danger could give strength of mind or will. "A sheep would make some struggle for her lamb," she thought angrily. "Mrs. Sheldon is lower than a sheep." It was the first time she had thought unkindly of this weak soul, and her anger soon melted to pity for the powerless nature which Mr. Sheldon held in such supreme control. She made no further attempt at resistance after this, but went to Charlotte's room and prepared for the journey. "Oh, why am I to be moved, dear?" the girl asked piteously. "I am too ill to be moved." "It is for your good, darling. Mr. Sheldon wants you to be near the great physicians who can give you health and strength." "There are no physicians who can do that. Let me stay here, Di. Beg papa to let me stay here." Diana hid her face upon the invalid's shoulder. Her tears choked her. To repress her grief was agony scarcely endurable, but she did hide all trace of anger and sorrow, and cheered the helpless traveller throughout the weariness of the journey. Charlotte was lying on a sofa in her bedroom, with Mrs. Woolper in attendance upon her, when Dr. Jedd arrived. It was 5:45, and the low western sunshine flooded the room. The physician came with Valentine, and did not ask to see Mr. Sheldon before going to his patient's room. He told the housemaid who admitted him to show the way to Miss Halliday's room. "The nurse is there, I suppose?" he said to the girl. "Yes, sir. Leastways, Mrs. Woolper." "That will do." Mr. Sheldon heard the voice in the hall, and came out of the library as the doctor mounted the step of the stairs. "Who is this? What is this?" he asked of Valentine Hawkehurst. "I told you I was not satisfied with Dr. Doddleson's opinion," answered the young man coolly. "This gentleman is here by appointment with me." "And pray by what right do you bring a doctor of your own choosing to visit my stepdaughter without previous consultation with me?" "By the right of my love for her. I am not satisfied as to the medical treatment your stepdaughter has received in this house, Mr. Sheldon, and I want to be satisfied. Miss Halliday is something more than your stepdaughter, remember. She is my promised wife. Dr. Jedd's opinion will be more assuring to me than the opinion of Dr. Doddleson." At the sound of Dr. Jedd's name, Mr. Sheldon started slightly. It was a name he knew only too well, a name he had seen among the medical witnesses in the great Fryar trial, the record of which had for him possessed a hideous fascination. He had fancied himself in the poisoner Fryar's place, and the fancy had sent an icy chill through his veins. But in the next minute he had said to himself, "I am not such a reckless fool as that man Fryar was, and have run no such risks as he ran." At the name of Jedd the same icy shiver ran through his veins again. His tone of suppressed anger changed to a tone of civility which was almost sycophantic. "I have the honour to know Dr. Jedd by repute very well indeed, and I withdraw my objection to your course of proceeding, my dear Hawkehurst, though I am sure Dr. Jedd will agree with me that such a course is completely against all professional etiquette, and that Dr. Doddleson will have the right to consider himself aggrieved." "There are cases in which one hardly considers professional etiquette. I shall be very happy to meet Dr. Doddleson to-morrow morning, but as Mr. Hawkehurst was very anxious that I should see Miss Halliday to-night, I consented to waive all ceremony and come with him on the spot." "I cannot blame his anxiety to secure so valuable an opinion. I only wonder what lucky star guided him to so excellent an adviser." Mr. Sheldon looked from Dr. Jedd to Valentine Hawkehurst as he said this. The physician's face told him no more than he might have learnt from a blank sheet of paper. Valentine's face was dark and gloomy, but that gloomy darkness might mean no more than natural grief. "I will take you to my stepdaughter's room at once," he said to the physician. "I think it will be better for me to see the young lady alone," the doctor answered coolly, "that is to say, in the presence of her nurse only." "As you please," Mr. Sheldon replied. He went back to his study. Georgie was sitting there, whimpering in a feeble way at intervals, and near her sat Diana, silent and gloomy. A settled gloom, as of the grave itself, brooded over the house. Mr. Sheldon flung himself into a chair with an impatient gesture. He had sneered at the inconvenience involved in uncarpeted floors, but he was beginning to feel the aggravation of that inconvenience. These two women in his study were insupportable to him. It seemed as if there was no room in the house in which he could be alone, and just now he had bitter need of solitary meditation. "Let them arrange the dining room somehow, carpet or no carpet," he said to his wife. "We must have some room to dine in, and I can't have you here, Georgie. I have letters to write." Mrs. Sheldon and Diana were not slow to take the hint. "I'm sure I don't want to be here, or anywhere," exclaimed Georgie, in piteous accents. "I feel so miserable about Charlotte that if I could lie down and die, it would be a comfort to me. And it really seems a mockery having dinner at such a time. It's just as it was during poor Tom's illness. There were fowls and all sorts of things cooked, and no one ever ate them." "For God's sake, go away!" cried Mr. Sheldon, passionately. "Your perpetual clack is torture to me." Georgie hurried from the room, followed closely by Diana. "Did you ever see any one more anxious?" Mrs. Sheldon asked, with something like pride. I would rather see Mr. Sheldon less anxious, Diana answered gravely. End of Chapter 1. Something Too Much. Book the 9th, Chapter 2 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 2, Dr. Jedd's Opinion. Alone, Philip Sheldon breathed more freely. He paced the room, waiting for the appearance of the doctor, and with almost every turn he looked at the clock upon the chimney-piece. How intolerable seemed the slow progress of the moments! How long that man Jedd was staying in the sick-room! And yet not long. It was he, Philip Sheldon, who was losing count of time. Where was Valentine? He opened the door of the room and looked out. Yes, there was a figure on the stairs. The lover was waiting the physician's verdict. A door on the landing above opened, and the step of the doctor sounded on the upper flight. Mr. Sheldon waited for Dr. Jedd's appearance. "I shall be glad to hear your opinion," he said quietly, and the doctor followed him into the study. Valentine followed the doctor, to Mr. Sheldon's evident surprise. "Mr. Hawkehurst is very anxious to hear what I have to say," said Dr. Jedd, "and I really see no objection to his hearing it." "If you have no objection, I can have none," Mr. Sheldon answered. "I must confess your course of proceeding appears to me altogether exceptional, and—" "Yes, Mr. Sheldon, but then you see the case is altogether an exceptional case," said the physician gravely. "You think so?" "Decidedly. The young lady is in extreme danger. Yes, Mr. Sheldon, in extreme danger. The mistake involved in her removal to-day is a mistake which I cannot denounce too strongly. If you had wanted to kill your stepdaughter, you could scarcely have pursued a more likely course for the attainment of your object. No doubt you were actuated by the most amiable motives. I can only regret that you should have acted without competent advice." "I believe myself to be acting for the best," replied Philip Sheldon in a strange, mechanical way. He was trying to estimate the true meaning of the doctor's address. Was he merely expressing anger against an error of ignorance or stupidity, or was there a more fatal significance in his words? "You overwhelm me," the stockbroker said presently. "You positively overwhelm me by your view of my daughter's condition. Dr. Doddleson apprehended no danger. He saw our dear girl on Sunday morning yesterday morning," added Mr. Sheldon, wonder-stricken to find that the interval was so brief between the time in which he had walked with Valentine and Dr. Doddleson in the garden at Harold's Hill and the present moment. To Valentine it seemed still more wonderful. What a bridgeless gulf between yesterday morning and to-night! All his knowledge of this man Sheldon, all the horror involved in Tom Halliday's death, had come upon him in that brief span. "I should like to see Dr. Doddleson's prescriptions," said Dr. Jedd with grave politeness. Mr. Sheldon produced them from his pocket-book with an unshaken hand. No change of countenance, no tremulous hand, no broken voice betrayed his apprehension. The one distinguishing mark of his manner was an absent, half-mechanical tone, as of a man whose mind is employed otherwise than in the conversation of the moment. Prompt at calculation always, he was at this crisis engaged in a kind of mental arithmetic. The chances of defeat, so much; the chances of detection. A rapid survey of his position told him what those chances were. Detection by Dr. Jedd? Yes, that had come to him already, perhaps, but would any actual harm to him come of such detection? He calculated the chances for and against this, and the result was in his favour. That Dr. Jedd should form certain opinions of Miss Halliday's case was one thing, that he should give public utterance to those opinions was another thing. What can his opinion matter to me? Mr. Sheldon asked himself. Opinion cannot touch me in a case where there is no such thing as certainty. He has seen the dilatation of the pupil, even that old fool Doddleson saw it, and has taken fright. But no jury in England would hang a man on such evidence as that. Or if a jury could be found to put the rope round a man's neck, the British public and the British press would be pretty sure to get the rope taken off again. Chloric ether, spirits of ammonia, yes, muttered Dr. Jedd, looking at one prescription. Quinine, yes, aqua pura, he murmured, looking at another. He threw them aside with a half-contemptuous gesture, and then took up a pen and began to write. My mode of treatment will be quite different from that adopted by Dr. Doddleson, he said, but I apprehend no difficulty in bringing that gentleman round to my view of the case when we meet. As he wrote his prescription, Philip Sheldon rose and looked over his shoulder. The form of the prescription told him that Dr. Jedd knew all. He had suspected this from the first, and the confirmation of this suspicion did not shake him. He grew firmer, indeed, for now he knew on what ground he was standing, and what forces were arrayed against him. I really do not understand the basis of your treatment, he said, still looking over the physician's shoulder. Dr. Jedd turned his chair with a sudden movement and faced him. Am I talking to Mr. Sheldon, the stockbroker, or Mr. Sheldon, the surgeon-dentist? He asked. This was a blow. This allusion to the past was a sharper stroke than any that Philip Sheldon had before received. He looked at Valentine, from Valentine to the physician. What did it mean, this mention of the past? That blabbing fool George had talked to his friend of the days in Fitzgeorge Street, no doubt, and Valentine had blabbed Mr. Sheldon's antecedents to the physician. Was this what it all meant, or did it mean more than this? Whatever it might mean, he faced the hidden danger and met the uncertainties of his position as calmly as he met its certainties. I have no desire to interfere with your treatment, he said very quietly, but I have some knowledge of the pharmacopoeia, and I confess myself quite at a loss to understand your prescription. Dr. Doddleson will understand it when he has heard my opinion. There is no time to be lost. Mr. Hawkehurst, will you take this to the chemist and wait for the medicine? Miss Halliday cannot take it too soon. I shall be here to-morrow at 9 o'clock. If you wish me to see Dr. Doddleson, Mr. Sheldon, you will perhaps arrange an appointment with him for that hour. It is rather an early hour. No hour is too early in a case attended with so much danger. Perhaps it will be as well for me to call on Dr. Doddleson as I drive home. I shall make a point of seeing Miss Halliday twice a day. I find your housekeeper a very sensible person. She will remain in close attendance upon the sick-room. And I must beg that there is no quackery, no home-made remedies. I have given your housekeeper all directions as to treatment and diet, and she has my orders to allow no one but herself in the invalid's room. There is a marked tendency to delirium, and quiet is indispensable. I have said as much myself, answered Mr. Sheldon. Mr. Hawkehurst will undertake to see to the making up of my prescriptions, continued Dr. Jedd, as he drew on his gloves. He is very anxious about the young lady, and it will afford him some relief of mind to be employed in her service. No, thanks, he said, putting aside Mr. Sheldon's hand, as that gentleman offered him his fee. I have already received my honorarium from Mr. Hawkehurst. There was no more to be said. The physician wished the two men good evening, and returned to his carriage, to be driven home to dinner by way of Plantagenet Square, where he saw Dr. Doddleson, and appointed to meet him next day, much to the delight of that individual, who was proud to be engaged in a case with the great Jed. Valentine left the house on the heels of the doctor. He came back in about 20 minutes with the medicine. He did not go to the principal gate, but to a little side gate near the offices of the Gothic villa, a gate to which butchers and bakers came with their wares in the morning. "I want to see Miss Paget," he said to the maid who answered his summons, "and I want to see her without disturbing Mr. and Mrs. Sheldon. Do you know where to find her?" "Yes, sir. She's in her own room. I took her a cup of tea there 10 minutes ago. She's got a headache with fretting about our poor young lady, and she won't go down to dinner with Master and Missus." "Will you ask her to step out here and speak to me for a few minutes?" "Won't you come indoors and see her, sir?" "No, I'd rather see her in the garden." It was still daylight here, but it was growing shadowy among the avenues in Kensington Gardens. The gate near which Valentine waited was not to be seen from the windows of dining or drawing-room. The housemaid ran off to summon Miss Paget, and in less than 5 minutes Diana appeared, dressed in her hat and garden jacket. "Will you come out into the road with me, dear?" asked Valentine. "I have something serious to say to you." "And I am so anxious to hear what the doctor has said," answered Diana, as she took Valentine's arm. The road before the lawn was very quiet at this hour of the evening, and here they were safely beyond Mr. Sheldon's ken. "Tell me the doctor's opinion, Valentine," Diana said eagerly. "Does he think the case very serious?" "He does. It is more serious than you or I could have imagined, if Providence had not helped me to discover the truth." "What do you mean, Valentine?" He gave her in brief the story of his day's work. She listened to him breathlessly, but uttered no exclamation until his story was finished. "It is most horrible," she said at last, "but I believe it is most true. There has been so much in that man's conduct that has mystified me, and this explains all. But what earthly motive can have prompted this hideous crime?" "He believes that he has a beneficial interest in her death. I cannot fully understand his motive, but rely upon it, there is a motive, and a sufficient one, and I have let that man delude me into belief in his honesty after I had been warned against him. But there is no time for regrets. Diana, I look to you to help me in saving my dear love." "It is not too late to save her?" "Dr. Jedd will commit himself to no positive statement. He tells me she is in danger, but he does not refuse all hope. Now listen, my dear. In that house I have only two people to help me, Ann Woolper and yourself. Ann Woolper I hold only by a feeble bond. I think she will be true to us, but I am not sure of her. Sheldon's influence over her is a powerful one, and God knows what concession he might extort from her. She is the ostensible guardian of Charlotte's room. You must contrive to be the real guardian. You must keep custody over the custodian. How is your room situated in relation to Charlotte's room?" "The doors of the two rooms are exactly opposite." "Providence favours us there. Can you keep watch over Charlotte's door from your room without making your guardianship too apparent?" "I can. Day and night?" "Day and night." "God bless you, dear. Her life may be saved by your fidelity." "I would do as much to render her a smaller service." "My dear girl, and now go back to the house. Here is the medicine. You will give that into Mrs. Woolper's hands. She has received her instructions from Dr. Jedd, and those instructions leave no room for doubt. If she permits Sheldon to tamper with the medicine or the food of her patient, she will be the wilful accomplice of a murderer. I think she may be trusted. I will watch her. The charge of procuring the medicine is mine. I shall come to this house many times in the course of every day, but I am bound to prepare myself for the hour in which Mr. Sheldon may forbid me his house. In that event I shall come to this gate. I suppose the servants would stand by me if you pleaded for me. I am sure they would. And now, dear, go. The medicine is wanted. I shall come back in a few hours to inquire if there is any change for the better. Go." They had returned to the gate ere this. He grasped the hand which she held out to him, and stood by the little gate, watching her till she had disappeared through the door of the servants' quarters. When the door closed, he walked slowly away. He had done all that it was possible for him to do, and now came his worst misery. There was nothing left for him but to wait the issue of events. What was he to do? Go home to his lodgings, eat, drink, sleep? Was it possible for him to eat or to sleep while that precious life trembled in the balance? He walked slowly along the endless roads and terraces in a purposeless way. Careless people pushed against him, or he pushed against them. Children brushed past him as they ran. What a noisy, busy, clattering world it seemed! And she lay dying. Oh, the droning, dreary organs and the hackneyed, common tunes, how excruciating they were to him to-night! He emerged into the high road by and by in all the bustle and riot of Notting Hill. The crowded shops, the clamorous people seemed strange to him. It was like the clamour of a foreign city. He walked on past the bustle and riot, by the quieter terraces near Holland Park, and still held on to Shepherd's Bush, where he went into a little public house and called for some brandy. There was a bench on one side of the space in front of the bar, and towards this he pushed his way. "Where are you shoving to, my young swell?" growled a sturdy cabman, indignant at the outrage inflicted by Valentine's elbows. But in the next moment the sturdy cabman dashed suddenly forward and caught the young swell in his strong arms. "My eye, young un!" he cried. "Where do you want to go to? Here, some one bring a mug of cold water. I'm blessed if he ain't in a fit." Happily it was no fit, only a dead faint into which Mr. Hawkehurst had fallen. He came back to consciousness presently, after a few spoonfuls of brandy had been forced into his mouth, and looked about him with a helpless stare. "I'm jiggered if I don't believe he's fainted for the want of wittles," cried the cabman. "They keeps up till they drop sometimes, these seedy swells. Walks about looking like so many Dossays on a hempty stomach. Here, some one bring a plate o' cold meat, and look sharp about it. I'll stand Sam." Valentine looked up with a faint smile. "And I'll stand Sam for anything you like to order, my friend," he said, holding out his hand to the good-natured cabman. "I've eaten nothing since last night, but I haven't fasted for want of money. There are worse troubles than an empty pocket, and I'm not unacquainted with that." "I'm sure I beg your pardon, sir," said the man sheepishly, very much ashamed of his benevolence; "but you see it ain't the fust time I've seen a swell come to the pavement with a cropper, in consequence of having gone it too fast, and cleaned hisself out, in a manner of speaking." End of Chapter 2. Dr. Jedd's opinion. Book the 9th, Chapter 3 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 3, Non Dormit Iudice. The summer darkness closed round the Bayswater villa, but of sleep there was little for any one in that household during this sad night. Is there not in almost every household a memory of such days and nights, dread intervals in which the common course of life and time seems to be suspended, and all the interests of the universe hang upon the fitful breath of one dear sufferer? Lonely were the watchers in Mr. Sheldon's house. Georgie was in her own room, forbidden to disturb the invalid by her restless presence, now lying down, now pacing to and fro, now praying a little, now crying a little, the very ideal of helpless misery. In the sick room there was no one but the invalid and Ann Woolper. In the room opposite watched Diana Paget, her door ajar, her senses sharpened by anxiety, quick to hear the faintest sound of footfall on the stairs, or to feel the slightest vibration from stealthily opened door on the story below. Alone in the study sat Philip Sheldon at the table where he was accustomed to write, a blank sheet of paper before him, a pen held loosely in his outstretched hand, and his eyes fixed in an unseeing gaze upon the bookcase opposite, the living image of care. Now that the turmoil of the day was done and there was silence in the house, he had set himself to face his position. It was no trifling task which he had to perform. Not one difficulty, or one set of difficulties, had he to meet and master. The armed enemies upspringing from the dragon's teeth which he had sown were not to be set fighting amongst themselves, nor were they to be smashed by any rocks that he could hurl amongst them. They stood around him in an awful circle, and turn which way he would, he saw the same appalling figure, armed to the teeth and invincible as death. What had he to fear? Detection of a past crime? No, that was a fool's terror which shook him at the sound of Tom Halliday's name. A child's fear of the nursery bogey. Detection in the present was more to be dreaded. The work that he had done was, according to his belief, work that could not be proved against him. But there are crimes of which to be accused is to be condemned. Lawyers may plead and juries may acquit, but the fiat of public opinion goes forth against the suspected wretch, and on his forehead forever shows the dark brand of Cain. For the criminal of almost every shade of color, save this one dread hue, society has a sanctuary and earth a refuge. The forger may find a circle in which the signing of another man's name under the pressure of circumstances is held to be a misfortune rather than an offence. The swindler has the gentlemanly brotherhood and sisterhood of Macaire for his family, and need never be lonely. The thief may dance away his jovial nights among kindred spirits, and be carried to his grave by sorrowing fellow artists. The coiner may be jolly in his hiding place among his chosen band of brother coiners. But for the murderer there is no such thing as human sympathy. And when the blood of Nancy dyes his cruel hand, Bill Sykes may thank God if he has a dog that will follow him to his wretched inn, for from mankind he can hope nothing. Mr. Sheldon did not contemplate his position from any sentimental point of view, but he told himself that to be suspected of having poisoned his friend, and to be accused of poisoning or attempting to poison his daughter, would be ruin. Ruin social and commercial, ruin complete and irretrievable. And having faced one of these dread armed antagonists, he passed on to another shadowy enemy. What if Charlotte recovered, and he escaped the taint of uttered suspicion? For Dr. Jedd's private opinion he cared very little. What then? Then the grim antagonist lifted his visor and showed him the countenance of commercial disgrace. Unless within the next few weeks he could command from £8,000 to £10,000, his disgrace as a member of the Stock Exchange was inevitable. Charlotte's death would give him the means of raising as much upon the policies of assurance obtained by her, and which by the terms of her will he would inherit. The life insurance people might be somewhat slow to settle his claims, but he had all possible facilities for the raising of money upon any tangible security, and he could count upon immediate cash in the event of Charlotte's death. But what if she should not die? What if this nameless languor, this mysterious atrophy, taken vigorously in hand by Dr. Jedd should be vanquished, and the girl should live. What indeed? A sharp spasm contracted the stockbroker's hard, cold face as he pictured to himself the result of failure. He saw the crowd of busy faces in the house, and heard the low hum of many voices and the dull sound of the big half-glass doors swinging to and fro, and the constant tread of hurrying feet. He heard the buzz of voices and the tramp of feet stop as suddenly as if that busy tide of human life had been arrested by an enchanter's wand. The enchanter is no other than the head waiter of the Stock Exchange, who takes his position by a stand in the midst of that great meeting-place and removes his hat. After that sudden silence comes a faint sound of anxious whisperings, and then again a second silence, still more profound, prevails in that assembly. 3 times, with wooden hammer sounding dull against the woodwork of his stand, the waiter raps his awful rap. To some it is the call of doom. The commercial nemesis hides her awful countenance. Slow and solemn sound those 3 deliberate strokes of the wooden hammer. You can hear the stertorous breathing of an apoplectic stockbroker, the short panting respiration of some eager speculator. The rest is silence. And then the voice of the waiter, proxy for the commercial nemesis, calmly enunciates the dread decree. Philip Sheldon begs to inform the members of the House that he cannot comply with his bargains. A sudden flutter of the leaves of many note-books follows that awful announcement. Voices rise loud in united utterance of surprise or indignation. The doors swing to and fro as hurrying members dash in and out to scan the market and ascertain how far they may be affected by this unlooked-for failure. This was the scene which the watcher pictured to himself, and for him fate could wear no aspect more terrible. Respectability, solvency, success, these were the idols to which he had given worship and tribute in all the days of his life. To propitiate these inexorable ones, he had sacrificed all the dearest and best blessings which earth and heaven offer to mankind. Rest or happiness, as other men consider these blessings, he had never known. The sense of triumph in success of the present, the feverish expectation of success in the future, these had stood to him in the place of love and hope, pleasure and idleness, all the joys and comforts of this lower world, and all the holy dreams of purer pleasures in a world to come. One vague brief thought of all that he had sacrificed flashed across his brain, and swift upon his track followed the thought of what he stood to lose. Something more than his position upon the Stock Exchange was at stake. He had done desperate things in the vain hope of sustaining that position against the destroying sweep of fortune's turning tide. Bills were afloat which he must meet, or stand before the world a detected forger. Bills drawn upon companies that were shadowy as the regions of their supposed operations. Bills amounting to £5,000 drawn upon the Honduras Mahogany Company Limited. Other bills amounting to upwards of £3,000 against the Pennsylvanian Anthracite Coal Corporation Limited. The sum he might raise on the policies of insurance would about cover these bills, and simultaneously with their withdrawal fresh bills might be floated, and the horse-leech cry of the brokers for contango might be satisfied until there came a reaction in the city and the turning tide should float him into some harbor of safety. Beyond this harbor shone a splendid beacon, the dead girl's inheritance, his, to claim by right of the same will that would give him the sum insured upon her life. Without this immediate ready money there was no extraction from the hideous labyrinth. His position had been already too long sustained by bills of exchange. There were people in the city who wanted, in vulgar parlance, to see the color of his money. He knew this, and knew how frail the tenure by which he held his position, and how dire the crash which would hurl him down to ruin. After the proclamation of his inability to meet his differences, the deluge, and looking gloomily athwart the flood and tempest, he saw neither ark nor Ararat. Charlotte's death was the one chance of redemption, and to that event he looked as to a figure in a mathematical proposition. Of this girl herself, with all her wealth of beauty and goodness, of hope and love, he had scarcely any definite idea. She had so long been no more to him than an important figure in the mathematics of his life, that he had lost the power to behold her in any other light. The hardness of his nature was something lower than absolute cruelty of heart. It was less human than the half-insane ferocity of a Nero. It was a calm indifference to the waste of human life, which, displayed upon a larger field of operation, would have made a monster cold and passionless as Sphinx or Chimera. "I must see Ann Woolper," he said to himself presently. "She will not dare to exclude me from that room." He listened to the striking of the Bayswater clocks. 2:00. Within and without the house reigned a profound silence. The room immediately over Mr. Sheldon's study was Charlotte's room, and here there had been for a long time no sound of life or movement. "Asleep, I dare say," muttered Mr. Sheldon. "Invalid and nurse both." He exchanged his boots for slippers, which he kept in a little cupboard below the bookshelves among old newspapers, and went softly from the room. The gas was burning dimly on the stairs and on the landing above. He opened the door of the invalid's room softly and went in. Mrs. Woolper was seated beside the bed. She looked up at him with unwinking eyes. "I thought you was abed, sir," she said. "No, I am too anxious to sleep." "I think every one is anxious, sir," Mrs. Woolper answered gravely. "How is your patient?" The pretty white curtains of the little brass Arabian bedstead were drawn. "She is asleep, sir. She sleeps a great deal. The doctor said that was only natural." "She has taken her medicine, I suppose?" said Mr. Sheldon. He glanced round the room as he asked this question, but could see no trace of medicine bottle or glass. "Yes, sir, she has taken it twice, the poor dear." "Let me look at the medicine." "The strange doctor said as I was to let no one touch it, sir." "Very likely, but that direction doesn't apply to me." "He said no one, sir." "You are an old fool," muttered Mr. Sheldon savagely. "Ah, no, sir," the housekeeper answered with a profound sigh. "I am wiser than I was when poor Mr. Halliday died." This answer, and the sigh, and the look of solemn sadness which accompanied it, told him that this woman knew all. She had suspected him long ago, but against her unsupported suspicion the mere force of his character had prevailed. She was wiser now, for on this occasion suspicion was confirmed by the voice of science. He stood for a few minutes looking at his old nurse with a dark, moody face. What could he feel except supreme indignation against this woman, who dared to oppose him when he had the best right to rely on her faithful service? She had promised him her fidelity, and at the first hint from a stranger she coolly deserted him and went over to the enemy. "Do you mean to say that you refuse to let me look at the medicine which you have been giving to my stepdaughter?" he asked. "I mean to say that I will obey the orders given me by the strange doctor," the old woman answered with a calm sadness of tone, "even if it turns you against me, you that have given me a comfortable home when there was nothing before me but the workhouse, you that I carried in my arms 40 years ago. If it was anything less than her dear life that was in danger, sir, and if I hadn't stood by her father's deathbed, I couldn't stand against you like this. But knowing what I do, I will stand firm as a rock between you and her, and think myself all the more truly your faithful servant because I do not fear to offend you." "That's so much arrant humbug, Mrs. Woolper. I suppose you've made your book with Miss Halliday and Miss Halliday's lover, and think you can serve your turn best by sticking to them and throwing me over the bridge. It's only the way of the world. You're genuine Yorkshire, and know how to pack your cards for winning the trick. But suppose I were to spoil your game by turning you out of doors neck and crop, what then?" "I don't think you'll do that, sir." "Why not, pray?" "I don't think you dare do it in the face of that strange doctor." "You don't? And so Dr. Jedd is the master of this house, is he?" "Yes, sir, till that poor dear young lady is well again, if ever that day comes. I think Dr. Jedd will be the real master in this house." "By Mrs. Woolper, you're a cool hand, I must say." He could say no more. Of passionate or declamatory language he had no command. The symbols of thought that obtained in his world were of a limited and primitive range. "You're a cool hand," he repeated under his breath, and then he turned and left the room, opening and closing the door less cautiously than on his entrance. The door of the opposite room was opened softly as he came out into the corridor, and Diana Paget stood before him, dressed as she had been in the day. "What," he exclaimed impatiently, "are you up to?" "Yes, Mr. Sheldon, I cannot sleep while Lotta is so ill." "Humph! I suppose you mean to get yourself on the sick list, and give us another invalid to nurse." "I will not trouble you to nurse me if I should be ill." "Ah!" growled the stockbroker as he went to his own room, "you are a pack of silly women altogether, and your fine friend Hawkehurst is more womanish than the silliest of you. Good night." He went into his own room, where he found his wife still awake. Her weak lamentings and bewailings were insupportable to him, and at 3 o'clock he went downstairs, put on his boots and a light overcoat, and went out into the dim regions of Bayswater, whence he saw the sun rise red above the eastern roofs and chimneys, and where he walked until the first clatter of hoofs and roll of wheels began to echo through the empty streets, and with faint distant cries of sweeps and milkwomen life's chorus recommenced. It was 7 o'clock when he went back to his house and let himself in softly with his latch-key. He knew that he had been walking a long time, and that he had seen the sun rise, but what streets or squares he had been walking in he did not know. He crept upstairs to his dressing-room with stealthy footsteps, and made an elaborate toilet. At 8 o'clock he was seated at breakfast in the hastily arranged dining-room, with the newspapers by the side of his cup and saucer. At 9 he went into the hall to receive Dr. Jedd and Dr. Doddleson, who arrived almost simultaneously. His carefully arranged hair and whiskers, his well-made unpretentious clothes, his spotless linen, would have done credit to an archbishop. Of all the cares and calculations of his long, dreary night there was no trace, except a certain dullness in his eyes and the dark half-circles below them. End of chapter 3. Non dormet iudice. Book the 9th, Chapter 4 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 4, Counting the Cost. For 4 days and 4 nights there were fear and watching in Mr. Sheldon's house, and in all that time the master never quitted it, except stealthily in the dead of the night, or at early daybreak, to roam in a purposeless manner he knew not where. The doctors came and went, Dr. Doddleson once a day, Dr. Jedd 2 or 3 times a day, and every one in villas adjoining and villas opposite, and even in villas round the corner, knew that the stockbroker's stepdaughter lay sick unto death. for the white horses of Dr. Jedd's landau were as the pale horse of the pale rider himself, and where they came was danger or death. Ah, thank God! To some they have brought hope and blessing, not always the dread answer, "You have called me in vain." Valentine Hawkehurst came many times in the day, but between him and Mr. Sheldon there could be no safe meeting, and the lover came quietly to the little gate, where a kindly housemaid gave him a little note from Diana Paget. Miss Paget wrote half a dozen little notes of this kind in the course of every day, but she never left her post in the room opposite the sick chamber. She complained of headache or of some vague illness which prevented her taking her meals in the dining-room, and Mr. Sheldon was fain to be satisfied with this explanation of her conduct. She was on guard, and the wretched master of the house knew that she was on guard, and that if Ann Woolper could be bought over or frightened into compliance with his wishes, this girl would still remain, faithful as watch-dog, by the door of her friend and companion. He asked himself whether by violent or diplomatic process he could rid himself of this second watcher, and the answer was in the negative. The circle around him was a circle not to be broken. His wife, as yet, had been told nothing of the suspicions that reigned in the breasts of other people. He knew this, for in his wife's face there was no token of that dark knowledge, and she, of all people, would be least skilled to deceive his scrutinizing eyes. Nor had the younger servants of his household any share in the hideous suspicion. He had watched the countenance of the maid who waited on him, and had convinced himself of this. It was something to know that even these were not yet leagued against him, but he could not tell at what moment they too might be sworn into that secret society which was growing up against him in his own house. Power to carry out his own schemes in the face of these people he felt that he had none. Upon the dark road which he had travelled until of late without let or hindrance, there had arisen all at once an insurmountable barrier, with the fatal inscription, "Here there is no thoroughfare." Beyond this barrier he could not pass. Sudden as the dread arrest of Lot's wife was the mandate which had checked his progress. He was brought to a dead stop, and there was nothing for him to do but to wait the issue of fate. He stood, defiant, unabashed, face to face with the figure of Nemesis, and calmly awaited the lifting of the veil. He hoped that Charlotte Halliday would die. If by her death he could tide over his difficulties and drift into smooth water, it would be but a very small thing to him that Dr. Jedd and Dr. Doddleson, enlightened by his colleague, and Valentine Hawkehurst, and Diana Paget, and a stupid, pig-headed old Yorkshire woman, should carry in their minds for the remainder of their lives the suspicion that by his means that fair young life had been brought to its early close. What would it amount to in the future of his own existence? Prudential considerations would induce these people to lock the secret of this suspicion in their own breasts. Dr. Jedd would bow to him somewhat coldly, perhaps, if they met in the streets of London, or possibly might refuse to make any return to his passing salutation, but the cut direct from Dr. Jedd would not cast a shadow over his commercial career, or even weaken his social position. If by the loud folly of Hawkehurst some evil rumour about him should float as far eastward as the Stock Exchange, who would be found to give credence to the dark report? Men would shrug their shoulders and shake their heads incredulously, and one of these wise men of the East would remark that "a fellow in Sheldon's position doesn't do that kind of thing, you know," while another would say, "I dined with him at Greenwich last summer, and a remarkably good dinner he gave us. Dawkins, the great shipbuilder, and Macpherson of Macpherson and Flinders, the Glasgow merchants, were there. Very jolly affair, I assure you. Deuced gentlemanly fellow, Phil Sheldon. And so the matter would end. Would there be an inquest in the event of his stepdaughter's death? Well, no. Jed knew that in such a case all post-mortem inquiry must end in confusion and perplexity, statement and counter-statement from medical witnesses who would contradict one another persistently in the support of their pet theories, and who would regard the investigation as a very convenient opportunity for ventilating their own opinions and airing their own importance. A considerable number of the canine race would be slaughtered, perhaps in the process of dilettante experiments. The broad principles of chemical science would be discussed from every point of view in innumerable letters published in the Zeus and the Diurnal Hermes, and the fact that an amiable and innocent young woman had been foully murdered would be swept out of the minds of mankind before a whirlwind of technical debate. Jed was the last man to stake his reputation upon such a hazard. No, Mr. Sheldon knew that he had played a cautious game, and if he should ultimately lose the stake for which he had ventured, it would be because he had been just a little too cautious. These things are generally done too quickly, he said to himself. My mistake has been to make matters too slow. Come what might of after consequences to himself from Charlotte Halliday's illness or death, he had no apprehension. Thus it was that he met Dr. Jedd day after day with a face as calm as the stony countenance of that distinguished physician himself. Such anxiety as an affectionate stepfather should feel during the peril of his stepdaughter, Mr. Sheldon took care to express. Greater anxiety than this by no look or gesture did he betray. He knew that he was watched, and that the people about him were inimical to himself and to his interests, and he was never off his guard. It had been necessary for him to come to London in order to be within easy reach of that troubled sea, the money market. But perilous though the voyage of his bark across that tempestuous ocean was, he could not guide the helm in person. He was obliged to confide matters to the care of Mr. Frederick Orcott, whom he harassed with telegraphic dispatches at all hours of the day, and who at this period seemed to spend his life between the stockbroker's office and Bayswater. It seemed as if Mr. Sheldon meant to hold his ground in that house until the issue of events was determined. Valentine Hawkehurst and George Sheldon met at the solicitors' offices, and there was a long and serious consultation between them. "One thing seems pretty clear," said George conclusively, "and that is that my brother Phil isn't to be got off the premises except by some very deep move. The question is, what move can be deep enough to trap such a man as he? He's a man who knows the inside of your mind better than you do yourself, and can reckon you up as easily as the simplest sum in arithmetic." The two men talked together very seriously for some time after this, and on the same day Valentine lay in wait for Dr. Jedd as he left Philip Sheldon's house, and was driven back to town in that gentleman's carriage. On the road there was much serious talk between Miss Halliday's physician and Miss Halliday's lover. Valentine was still very grave and very anxious when he took his leave of Dr. Jedd, but he was more hopeful than he had been for the last few days. On the same evening Gustave Lenoble received a brief epistle from his plighted wife. "My dear Gustave, I regret to find from your letter that the doctors consider my father weaker than when I was last at Knightsbridge. But even knowing this, I cannot come to him just yet. The duty which detains me here is even more sacred than his claim upon my care, and I know your goodness to him, and feel that in you he has a better friend and comforter than I could be to him. I thank you, dear, for your kindness to this poor broken down wanderer, even more than for your generous devotion to me. And now I am going to ask you a favour. It is that you will afford Mr. Hawkehurst, the person who will give you this letter, the help of your friendship and counsel in very difficult and critical circumstances, which he will explain to you. I have spoken to you of him very little, though his devotion to my dear adopted sister, Charlotte Halliday, brings him very near to me. Her long and of late dangerous illness has been a bitter time of trial to him, even more than to me, but the trial has proved him true as steel. I think your counsel may be of some service to him just now, and I am sure your friendship will help to support him in a period of acute anxiety. Do not ask to see me, dear Gustave. I cannot leave this house while Charlotte is in danger, but if it please God to remove that danger, I shall then be free to go where I please, and my future life shall be at your disposal. Do not think me cold or ungrateful. I am only faithful to the first friend I ever knew. Yours always, with all affection, Diana Paget. End of Chapter 4. Counting the Cost. Book the 9th, Chapter 5 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 5. The Beginning of the End. 3 days elapsed after the delivery of this letter. Upwards of a week had gone by since the return of Mr. Sheldon and his family from Harold's Hill, and as yet Philip Sheldon knew not what the issue of events was to be. Very vague were the oracular sentences which his questioning extorted from Dr. Jedd, and he had tried in vain to obtain a tete-a-tete interview with Dr. Doddleson. The physician of Burlington Row took care that his feeble colleague should not fall alone and defenceless into the pathway of Philip Sheldon. Of Charlotte's actual condition her stepfather, therefore, knew very little. He was told that her state was attended by danger, and the solemn faces which greeted him on every side implied that the danger was extreme. From her room he was in a manner excluded. If he went to her door to make some benevolent and paternal inquiry, he was met on the threshold by Ann Woolper, the sleepless and unresting. If he hinted a natural desire to see his invalid stepdaughter, he was told that she had that moment fallen asleep, or that she was too ill to see him. There was always some plausible reason why he should not be admitted to her room, and finding that this was so, he did not press the question. He had taken Mrs. Woolper's measure, and had found that she was too strong for him, doubly strong since she was supported and sustained by that second sleepless watcher, Diana Paget, whom Mr. Sheldon had long ago pronounced to be a strong-minded and superior young person. From his wife he could obtain no real information, nothing but weepings and lamentations, weak apprehensions of future woe, weaker retrospective reflections on the fatal illness and untimely end of her first husband. Georgie was admitted once or twice a day to the sick room, but she emerged therefrom no wiser than she entered it. Sorrow in the present, and the fear of greater sorrow to come, had utterly prostrated this poor weak soul. She believed what other people told her to believe. She hoped what they told her to hope. She was the very incarnation and express image of helpless misery. So, in utter darkness of mind, Mr. Sheldon awaited his destiny. The day drew very near on which he must find certain sums of ready money, or must accept the dreary alternative of ruin and disgrace. He had the policies of assurance in his cash-box, together with the will which made him Charlotte's sole legatee. He had fixed in his own mind upon the man to whom he could apply for an advance of £4,000 on one of the two policies, and he relied on getting his banker to lend him money on the security of the second. But for the one needful event he had yet to wait. That event was Charlotte Halliday's death. Of his dreary wanderings in the early morning the household knew nothing. The time which he chose for these purposeless rambles was just the time when no one was astir. The watchers in the two rooms above heard neither his going out nor his coming in, so stealthy were his movements on every occasion. But without this intermission from the dreadful concentration of his life, without this amount of physical exercise and fresh air, Philip Sheldon could scarcely have lived through this period. The solitude of shipwrecked mariner cast upon a desolate island could hardly be more lonely than this man's life had been since his return from Harold's Hill. From his study to the dining-room, and from the dining-room back to his study, was the only variety of his dreary days and nights. He had an iron bedstead put up in his study, and there he lay in the earlier hours of the night, taking such rest as he could from fitful dozing that was scarcely sleep, or from brief intervals of heavy slumber made horrible by torturing dreams. In this room he could hear every sudden movement in the hall, every footstep on the stairs, every opening and shutting of the outer door. Here, too, he could keep his watch, holding himself ready to counter the movements of his enemies, should any opportunity arise for action on his part, defensive or aggressive. To this room he stealthily returned one brilliant summer morning as the clocks were striking 6. He had been walking in the Bayswater Road amidst all the pleasant stir and bustle of early morning, wagons coming in from the country, milk-women setting forth on their daily rounds, clamorous young rooks cawing among the topmost branches of the elms, songbirds chirruping and gurgling their glad morning hymn, and over all things the glory and the freshness of the summer sunshine. But to Philip Sheldon it was as if these things were not. For the last 12 or 15 years of his life he had taken no heed of the change of the seasons, except insomuch as the passage of time affected his bill-book, or the condition of that commercial world which was the beginning and end of his life. Now, less than ever, had he an ear for the carolling of birds, or an eye for the glory of summer sunlight, or the flickering shadows of summer leaves, faintly stirred by the soft summer wind. He re-entered his house with a half-dazed sense of the stir and life that had been about him in the high road. It was a relief to him to escape this life and brightness, and to take shelter in the gloom of his study, where the shutters were closed, and only a faint glimmer of day crept through a chink in the shrunken woodwork. For the first time since the beginning of this dreary period of idleness and suspense, he felt himself thoroughly beaten, and instead of going up to his dressing-room for his careful morning toilet, as it was his habit to do at this hour, he flung himself, dressed as he was, upon the low iron bedstead, and fell into a heavy slumber. Yes, there they were, the familiar tortures of his slumbers, the shadows of busy, eager faces, and upon all one universal expression of mingled anger and surprise. The sound of a wooden hammer striking 3 solemn strokes, the faint tones of Tom Halliday's voice, thanking him for his friendly care, the dying look in Tom Halliday's face, turned to him with such depth of trust and affection. And then across the shadowy realm of dreams there swept the slow, solemn progress of a funeral cortege, plumed hearses blacker than blackest night, innumerable horses with funereal trappings, and plumed headgear waving in an icy wind. Long trains of shrouded figures stretching on into infinite space, in spectral procession that knew neither beginning nor end, and in all the solemn crowd, passing perpetually with the same unceasing motion, there was no sound of human footfall, no tramp of horse's hoof, only that dismal waving of black plumage in an icy wind, and the deep boom of a bell tolling for the dead. He awoke with a start and exclaimed, "If this is what it is to sleep, I will never sleep again." In the next minute he recovered himself. He had been lying on his back. The endless pageant, the dreadful tolling of the funeral bell, meant no more than nightmare, the common torment of all humanity. "What a fool I must be!" he muttered to himself as he wiped his forehead, which had grown cold and damp in the agony of his dream. He opened the shutters and then looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. To his surprise, he found that he had been sleeping 3 hours. It was 9 o'clock. He went upstairs to dress. There was an unusual stir in the corridor above. Ann Woolper was standing there, with her hand on the door of the sick-room, talking to Diana, who covered her face suddenly as he approached and disappeared into her own room. The beating of his heart quickened suddenly. Something had happened to disturb the common course of events. Something? What was likely to happen except the one dread circumstance for which he hoped and waited with such horrible eagerness? In Ann Woolper's solemn face he read an answer to his thought. For the first time he was well nigh losing his self-possession. It was with an effort that he steadied himself sufficiently to ask the usual conventional question in the usual conventional tone. "Is she any better this morning, Ann?" "Yes, sir, she is much better," the Yorkshirewoman answered solemnly. "She is where none can harm her now." Yes, it was the usual paraphrase of these vulgar people. He knew all their cant by heart. "You mean to say she is dead?" He no longer tried to conceal his agitation. It was a part of his duty to be agitated by the news of his stepdaughter's untimely death. "Oh, sir, you may well be sorry," said the Yorkshirewoman with deep feeling. "She was the sweetest, most forgiving creature that ever came into this world, and to the last no hard or cruel word ever passed her innocent lips. Yes, sir, she is gone. She is beyond the power of any one to harm her." "All that sort of stuff is so much hypocritical twaddle, Mrs. Woolper," muttered Mr. Sheldon impatiently, "and I recommend you to keep it for the chaplain of the workhouse in which you are likely to end your days. At what time did this sad event happen?" "About an hour ago." In the very hour when, in his hideous dream, he had beheld the solemn funeral train winding on forever through the dim realms of sleep. Was there some meaning in such foolish shadows after all? "And why was I not sent for?" "You were asleep, sir. I came downstairs myself and looked into your room. You were fast asleep, and I wouldn't disturb you." "That was very wrong, but it was of a piece with the rest of your conduct, which has been from first to last antagonistic to me. I suppose I can see my stepdaughter now," Mr. Sheldon added with a grim smile. "There is no further excuse about headache or sleep." "No, sir, you cannot see her yet. In an hour, if you wish to come into this room, you can come." "You are extremely obliging. I begin to doubt whether I am really in my own house. In an hour, then, I will come. Where is my wife?" "In her own room, sir, lying down. Asleep, I believe." "I will not disturb her. How about the registration, by the by? That must be seen to." "Dr. Jedd has promised to attend to that, sir." "Has Dr. Jedd been here?" "He was here an hour ago." "Very good. And he will see to that," muttered Mr. Sheldon thoughtfully. The event for which he had been so long waiting seemed at the last a little sudden. It had shaken his nerves more than he had supposed it possible that they could be shaken. He went to his dressing-room. and on this occasion made a very hasty toilet. The event had been tardy, and he had no time to lose in discounting it now that it had come to pass. He went from his dressing-room back to his study, took the jacket containing the policies of assurance and the will from the deed-box, and left the house. Chapter 5. The beginning of the end.